Um, I'm Elliot Levine, Research Director at the Aurora Institute, and let me start by saying how great it is to have everyone here today and how much I enjoyed connecting with so many of you as we developed today's research convening, and how much I appreciate your involvement. I'm also excited to introduce our next session, which will have presentations from 3 research teams who are actively building the evidence base for personalized learning. Each team will present for 12 minutes, and then after all 3 teams have presented, you will each have the opportunity to select one of the teams to join for another 15 minutes or so in a breakout room where they will share more information about their projects or have some discussions with you or both. And just a note to presenters, I will put a reminder in the chat after 10 minutes, so you know when you have 2 minutes left. And next slide, please. So let's get started with the first presentation, which is entitled, How Do We Measure Personalized Learning? Insights from Social, Emotional, and Academic Development and the Learning Sciences. And let's welcome Robert Balfanz of Johns Hopkins University.
Thank you, Elliot, and good morning, everybody. And I'm really excited to build upon where Jillian started us in a very inspiring keynote to really keep pondering this question of how do we measure personalized learning, right? If to build an evidence base, we have to sort of have an understanding of how we measure it and think deeply about that, because as Jillian pointed out, it's not that hard to get it wrong and end up with things that we think are being useful and progressive, and turns out they're not. So what I'm going to share with you is really a series of sort of, I guess, propositions and early findings, and this is really to aim to really just generate our thinking, right? There's no final reveal, spoiler alert, there's no last slide that says this is the framework. It's very much a work in progress. So we go to the first slide. Really our first hypothesis is that to measure personalized learning, we need both a practical and evidence-based framework that's rooted in the learning sciences. And the argument here is that there's a growing awareness of the power and utility and potential of personalized learning. This has been supported by advances in the learning sciences on learner variability and this idea of no average learner. But to spread from early adopters to the mainstream, we have some convincing to do, right? We've got to convince a range of stakeholders, from students and teachers and school boards and parents, that personalized learning not only leads to better outcomes, but they're outcomes that are worth the effort and expense involved, right? Because this is not going to be a simple transition without a lot of transitional costs and work and effort required. Next slide. And also the argument is that our existing measures might not cut it for this purpose, right? Most of our existing measures were designed to give us average outcomes and normative references. So that might miss or underestimate a lot of the potential impacts of personalized learning. Those outliers that Jillian showed, right? Those are pretty big in a normative framework. There's almost as many people outside the curve as inside the curve. But if we're going to move to new measures, right, they not only have to have validity, right? If we get, in reliability, and argue that be sort of, culturally responsive and sensitive, but they've got to be practically useful for the people doing them, right? These are teachers who don't have a lot of spare time that are going to be doing the assessing and the measuring, and students are going to be giving learning time to be measured, right? So it has to be things that are not burdensome, or disruptive. And if we're honest about it too, right, there has been a growing pushback among sort of disruptive and burdensome testing regimes, right? So we really have to think about that as we build a measurement framework for personalized learning. Okay, next slide. Our second proposition or hypothesis is that we need to root this in something. And we're making the argument to root it really in the learning sciences. To have a foundation for which the measures arise. And so the argument here is that if students build better knowledge bases, and not only build them, but are able to use them and access them better. If they learn how to learn better, right? If they become more independent learners and can learn on their own better, and if they're more motivated to learn, right? Then we've sort of demonstrated a sort of academic, cognitive, and social emotional outcomes, and sort of made a collective case for personalized learning. We're saying it's important that all those domains really show advancement. All right, next slide. So how can we do this? And as I said, there's no big reveal at the end, but we've been thinking about it for the past 2 years and drawing on 6 diverse data sources, really echoing what Stuart said, the importance of pulling from a lot of evidence sources, not just sort of one dominant domain. So we've been trying to learn from early adopters. We've been interviewing them and documenting what they've done. We've looked at the scientific literature on measuring academic knowledge and executive function and metacognition and motivation and social emotional development. We've done a very exciting field study with a group of 8th graders in a very diverse school in Denver, where we actually sort of co-design and co-work with them to figure out how can we measure what you're learning, and testing different approaches to personalized learning, some flipped approaches, some blended approaches, some project-based approaches, and a traditional approach, and tried to get them to give us their insights on what made sense to them. We did some large-scale quantitative work with a large data set we got from City Year across 29 districts, 400 schools, 40,000 students, with lots of detail on students' social emotional growth and their academic outcomes. And we've been doing some design thinking sessions this year, very exciting, with diverse groups of teachers, including experienced personalized learning users and people that are interested in it, trying to have them tussle with, well, how would you measure it? What would make sense to you? What would tell you it's worth it? And then finally, COVID-19, right, has been the great experiential learning situation for all of us. So it's really, we've drawn all across this to sort of get to our early findings and questions they bring. So next slide. So I'll quickly share some of our initial findings across those 3 areas of knowledge development, sort of learn to learn, and motivation, social emotional. So in knowledge development, interestingly enough, most of the early adopters of personalized learning are using norm reference tests or the learning management systems that are built into their softwares. And they're pretty happy with it because they tend to show progress. And if you believe something is important and you show progress, you're pretty happy. Some skeptics might argue, some of those people that need to be convinced that that's exciting that happens, but what does it compare to? Compared to other approaches, compared to other uses of time and resources, how does that compare, right? That we don't have so much of as of yet. As we know, the people on this call know, others may not, there is a huge literature and all quite contested on how to measure academic knowledge. But what there's a quite limited knowledge on is how to study knowledge activation and retention in authentic learning situations, right? We measure everything right after you've done it, you take your test or your cumulative for the year, but we don't come back a month later and say, how much of that have you retained? But if we're really trying to build knowledge bases, that question of retaining a month later and 5 months later is as important as your point in time. How much did you learn right after you learned it? How much could you remember, right? And really annual tests, right, sort of conflate all of this, right? They're sort of a measure of how much you learned, how well you retained it, how well you could activate it, but really with no way to differentiate across different strategies, which one of those things did better or worse, right? It's all just sort of jumbled together. All right, next slide. As I said, some of our greatest insights came from this field study, and there we basically did different units of a course. It was a course on sort of human rights and social studies, and each unit was taught in a different style. And then we asked them a month after each end of unit test to sort of take it again. And we found substantial learning loss across all methods. We found the greatest loss against traditional methods. And what's interesting here, and I'm trying to provoke our thinking, is that, learning loss is actually much more normative than we talk about, right? All under COVID, there's this huge thing of this huge learning loss. But if you take almost anything and measure kids a month later, there is learning loss if they're not using that knowledge in the meantime, right? So we really have to think about, this is a big problem in general, as much as a COVID-inspired one-time problem. So that's what's, and so the lack of these measures for how well knowledge is being activated after the fact and retained is a challenge, I think, for getting good measures of really anything, but personalized learning also. Next slide, quick here. All right, whoa, did that skip ahead? Shouldn't there be, there should be like a learn to learn slide? I can, all right, well, I know it's on the slide. So there should be a slide here on learn to learn. And what that showed for us is that most existing, oh, here it is, yes. Most existing measures for things like executive function and metacognition are not really practical for classroom use yet, right? They were designed to be individually administered with multiple items and complex scales. They were designed for kids that were identified as having learning issues, and you're trying to diagnose them at an individual level. There are some group assessments starting to emerge, but their practical usefulness has not really been tested yet. At the most cutting edge of stuff, there's this interesting work with interactive trace technologies built into online learning systems. Turns out almost most advanced in Australia, of all places, good place for a field trip. But really looking at ways that it's sort of interactively measuring how you interact with learning to give you sort of adaptive supports to build your metacognition as you go along, right? So it's sort of a formative approach to metacognition. Our 8th grade instructional design team actually piloted sort of this idea of a weekly survey of getting kids to report on their metacognitive impact of different strategies. And again, this is not validated. It's the very first rough pilot test. But it did show that they were able to give sort of thoughtful reflections on their ability to be reflective about their learning, to get very meta. And COVID-19 is showing, if nothing, that the importance of self-regulated learning, right? We're asking all of our kids to learn much more on their own and by themselves, and how important it is to have to know how to do that, right? You just can't be thrown in and figure it out on the moment. Next slide. And then the last one that somehow they got out of order was one on motivation. And really quickly on motivation, as many of us know, is that there's a lot of measures out there, each on different theories of action. So we really have to figure out which ones to use when, under what circumstances. There's a lively debate about surveys versus adult ratings. Are kids able to give accurate surveys of their social, emotional, and motivational state? Or is it better for adults to look to see what they see? Both have their strengths, their weaknesses. I think both will be two tools in the toolbox. I don't think there'll be a way to resolve one is better than the other. Our 8th graders experimented using emojis and cell phones to give rapid responses for how you're feeling. I know other people are working on this too. I actually think cell phones have a lot of promise for measurement tactics in schools to get sort of rapid feedback from kids. And our large-scale quantitative study really showed that big gains in social emotional were associated with big gains in learning. And that also, when you combined sort of working on an academic skill with building the social emotional skills to do it simultaneously, as sort of the Seed Commission recommended, both those things tend to move achievement. You got an impact directly from the support for learning and another one to build the social emotional skills. And you got an attendance boost as a benefit. But this did bring up a question, and this Jillian really centered on this, is there is a tension between short-term academic gains and longer-term educational outcomes. And we have to be really cognizant of that. Some of the things that can get you to do better on the test this week can have some long-term consequences. We can really try to pump up your self-management and your agency, and then we can also wear you out doing that. So there's some tensions to be resolved here between short and long term. All right, almost done. Next slide.
Oh, Bob, I'm sorry to jump in.
We're done.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to play this role a few times today, but the good news today is that we have the opportunity to join and hear 20 more minutes from any of the presenters in the breakout rooms. So Unfortunately need to pause there to make sure we get to all of our presenters. And thanks so much. It's really exciting to hear about about all of the studies you're doing, and also that extremely useful framework for thinking about the work we're doing. And I do encourage folks to, think about which session you want to join for the remaining breakout room time. Thanks so much, Bob,
Thank you.
for that presentation.